All right. My name is Jeremy Elder. I'm a staff product designer on the Foundations team. And typically I kind of go the Figma browser route for this, but I've been really wanting to present something to the team lately about inclusive input and how it relates to accessibility so that the work we do is uh, essentially more accessible and we lead to that. So this is a bit more of a formal presentation, not so much showing the work, but showing how I'm doing the work. And so I hope you find value in it. I think it's uh, roughly 30 minutes, but feel free to interject if you have anything. And I will jump in. So this is titled Inputs and Outputs. It's about inclusive design thinking, input that leads to accessible and rich output. And so I want to spend a few moments like focus on the mindset behind designing accessible solutions and leveraging the role of design, product design, experience design for more accessible outcomes, and how we as designers can have like a deeper consideration of the purpose and utility of the design, which is the input, and better prepare and hand off design artifacts and attributes and assets, which is the output. So on the screen is a mural of open hands, and it's a really great analogy where in practice we're both recipients and contributors. So this talk is about how to get input and have better output. I will mention WCAG, ARIA, other aspects of accessibility guidelines in practice, but I won't really walk through them. That would require just a ton of time. So, and there's a ton of great resources. I linked to some at the end of the deck here. So I want to start with a little background, and that's just how I came to care about accessibility. So in the late 90s, 1999 to be exact, I was given a brand new Gateway desktop computer. If you've ever owned one of these, you know the weight involved in one of these things. I also had a copy of Photoshop 5 and Adobe Go Live. And the monitor was huge, right? It was so convex that I actually had to scoot from side to side just to adjust the glare. And it was so far back in history that I actually had to go to Flickr just to find even like a picture of something that resembled it. Uh, I used like a laminate folding table, and the table strained under the weight. And my job was to take background art, my background in fine art, and apply it to learning how to create logos, websites for the organization I was a part of. But one of my first memorable experiences learning design input and output came a short time later when I was working on a pocket folder. So I had the template set up with guides, bleeds, like marks for the die cut, 100-pound cover weight, knew the quantities, but there was one really important input that I did not know about at the time, and that was color mode. So on screen, if you've ever done this, I designed like a beautiful, vibrant blue to black gradient behind the logo here, but it was in RGB when it was supposed to be in CMYK. And I don't remember any press checks, but what I do remember was getting a whole shipment of these pocket folders that had a muted purple gradient instead of a vibrant blue that I was expecting. Not to mention the banding in the gradient because I forgot to add noise. It was a huge disappointment. And I had missed like the very important input that when designing for print, color mode is critical. This is an actual photo of that folder. I don't think it or the design has aged too well in the last 20 years. So as my career progressed, I continued to focus on digital as much as branding and print. And as a result, I worked on a lot of email campaigns. At this time, like the concept of pixel perfect was alive and well, kind of a carryover from the days of building websites with image maps and the like. But when I worked on email, something else started to surface for me, and that was the idea that not everyone experienced it the same way or even wanted to, right? There's plain text, rich text versions, then there's proprietary system fonts, email clients with their own rendering engines. So I started to wrestle with wanting pixel perfect control, but also relinquishing some of that control to users and systems. These new inputs, what I consider them, it changed the way I approach the work and a result how it was delivered. So starting to think through how the experience was being consumed and how I could do better at delivering it. So later, when responsive design came along, I was really hooked on making a single experience work on any device. Here's a photo of a few notebooks where I sketched out a few responsive page layouts. I had like grid notebooks like full of this stuff. And I started to care about the user in a different way, wanting to make experiences that matched how they were being consumed. It also got me thinking more about hierarchy, order, flow. And besides the presentation layer, I also began to be more concerned with what was happening with the code itself. I was questioning, like, was it good semantics? Was it performant? And so again, I found myself looking for more input to inform what I hope to be better design decisions. As years went by, I worked on style guides, email boilerplates, WordPress templates, and eventually design systems. So things that you could update in one place and the changes would propagate. In addition to working at an agency, I also spent several years on an in-house experience design team, filled in for front-end development for a time. But more and more, I just valued how gathering and satisfying requirements could exponentially propagate to better experiences. And that leads to today, where I've been focused on design systems for a few years now, and it allows me to contribute across a wide range of things. And I've learned that inclusive design thinking is really a necessary part of working on a product with such a diverse user base. But what I've come to value most through all of these experiences is how to obtain like the best possible input that leads to the best possible output. And that leads me back to the topic at hand, which is to incorporate inclusive input to help shape and empower design to express and carry forward accessible output. You might be familiar with the red thread concept or through lines. That's what this is about. It's about taking things, shifting the ideas, shifting accessibility further left, bringing it through the design and being able to express that in the artifacts that we hand off to actually get built. So I'll pause really quick, take a drink because I talk fast. All right, and feel free to, like I said, jump in and interrupt if you have questions. But I've been using the term inclusive and accessible quite a bit, so I want to establish just some general definitions that'll help us the rest of the way. And generally, these terms are pretty broadly applicable. So I've framed them specifically to address experience in product design. So first up, how do we think inclusively? Inclusive design is, as defined here, is the process of making an experience better for as many people as possible. And as part of that definition, I'm leveraging 7 inclusive design principles, which you can find at inclusivedesignprinciples.org. And those are to provide comparable experiences, to consider situation, be consistent, give control, offer choice, prioritize content, and add value. So keep these in mind. I'm going to use them later and unpack them a little more. There's also some other resources that would be really helpful about thinking through inclusive principles and an inclusive definition. And those can be found at Microsoft. If you just search like Microsoft Inclusive Design, you'll find it. That's a really great resource. And then gov.uk, gov.uk, their design principles are awesome. So I recommend checking those out as well. So what does it mean to be accessible? Well, accessibility is to provide access to content and functionality that enables consumption and contribution for everyone. And this boils down to accessibility isn't a feature, it's a necessity. It's got to be baked in. And the reason for that is because our role as it relates to design, we're often the ones that make it inaccessible. The web is mostly accessible by default. If we just use basic semantics and techniques, it's mostly accessible. So we're the ones that typically break it when we do design that doesn't have those considerations. An accessible experience that benefits everyone. So if you think about things like curb cuts, ramps, automatic doors, everyone benefits. And so that's our role. We want everyone to benefit from what we're creating. There's also a legal aspect. I don't typically hone in on that too much. I don't like to have that as kind of a motivator, but for some it is. Many areas around the globe, they do mandate satisfying some form of accessibility requirements. So we often have a legal responsibility, and at GitLab we do, and that's why we have our VPAT and other documentation. And lastly, it's just our responsibility to consider all the different ways users can access our content and our experience. I think Hayden Pickering said it well when he said inclusive design is the means and accessibility is the end. It's just that you get a lot more than just accessibility along the way. And what constitutes a disability? So final kind of definition here. Disability includes anything. It's visual, auditory, physical, speech, etc. It can be temporary, situational, permanent. So an example would be a concussion. That's a temporary disability. While hearing loss might be more permanent. a broken arm is situational. Trying to view a screen in sunlight is situational. Trying to listen to an instructional video in a loud environment. These are all situational kind of disabilities that impair our ability to fully learn from or glean from or participate in an experience. All right, so one of my favorite analogies to explain the relationship between inclusive design and accessibility is a playground. I can't remember where I first encountered this example, but it's stuck with me ever since. And so if you're aware of the original source, please let me know. But here's an aerial image of a playground, and there's 3 circular sections. It's surrounded by a manicure lawn and trees. And here's the difference. An inclusive playground has a variety of equipment for all types of play. It groups the equipment by capabilities or features. It provides areas for parents, supervisors, or others to rest. It includes seating and shade, has drinking fountains, waste receptacles, lighting. It uses surfaces and materials that match the activities, right? So paved walkways for pushing strollers or for comfortable walking, has soft wood chips below play areas, grass, etc. So these are all inclusive elements, but an accessible playground would have no barriers to entry. There's no gate, there's no access that somebody has to get through. It has wide pathways and ramps where stairs are used. So it's providing access for different people. It includes swings with backs and armrests for those who need support. It lowers the height of equipment so more users can reach it. It has alternate ways to access upper decks, right? So you can climb or there's stairs. So in this example, inclusive design really adds richness, but accessibility by definition is providing access to the playground. And that analogy leads us back to the topic at hand, which is that incorporating inclusive input to shape and empower the design to express and carry forward accessible output. So we want to incorporate these inclusive thinking and inclusive thoughts to create accessible output. And that leads me to kind of the crux of what I want to talk about, and that is a simple framework that I put together that helps inform my work. I'm still working like diligently to apply this and to really make it a day-to-day practice. And I call that the input and output framework. And so I've been working on employing this in my own work, and hopefully you see that expressed in some of the things that I do. If you don't, call me out on it, because I want to make sure that I'm kind of living up to this standard. And there's 3 simple elements to the framework. And that's inclusive input, the design, and the accessible output. Often I found that we focus on the design, but we really don't back up to think about the inclusive input. And then we don't move forward to think about how we're conveying that intent moving forward. So the 3 parts of this are intended to allow that through line of accessibility and inclusivity to continue through. And inclusive input, that informs the design decisions and constraints. You might call it requirements, acceptance criteria, etc. The design itself is created to satisfy those requirements. So it's not just purely conceptual or ideation or just, putting things together and seeing if they work. It's really aimed to satisfy that inclusive input. And then from that, we create accessible output. So we want to communicate the intent and accessibility features of that design so that when it gets implemented, the experience doesn't fall short. So starting with inclusive input, I'll dive into kind of each part of the framework and walk through what that looks like. So if you remember those 7 inclusive design principles that I mentioned in the original definition, I'm going to go through each one of those and unpack how we might frame those as a question. And the answers to those questions is our accessible input. It's what's going to inform our design. And you can call that, like I mentioned, requirements, acceptance criteria, considerations, constraints, something else. But honestly, in my career, I can't think of a more measurable way to deliver on a product promise than to satisfy input that makes it usable for as many people as possible. There's a little bit of reading here, so just bear with me as I kind of chatter through that. But I'm going to use those definitions from inclusivedesignprinciples.org, frame them in a question, and then demonstrate some examples of how that could actually be applied in a real world example. So 7 of these. So number 1 is to provide a comparable experience. And the definition of this is just to ensure that your interface provides a comparable experience for all. So all people can accomplish tasks in a way that suits their needs without undermining the quality of the content. So this first principle is really about thinking about what we're designing and how the different ways somebody can access that might be. And so the question is then, what content and functionality requires parity for the different ways it could be used or consumed? And so let's jump into some examples. A data visualization tool uses like the canvas element so that a chart data will also need to be provided in a table. So this first example is to say, okay, we've got these charts and they're rendered in the canvas, but the canvas itself is not going to be accessible. It's not going to be read by a screen reader. So we're going to need to provide that content in a table so that somebody using a screen reader or perhaps somebody that can't move through the rendering can access that content. So this is a comparable experience. It might be presented in a completely different way, but it's comparable. That same information and content can be accessed. Second example, a form submission results in an error. That error also has to be announced for a screen reader user. If we just purely put something on the screen, but we never indicate it for a screen reader user, they're never going to have a comparable experience and understand that there's an error that they need to address. And one of the most simple examples are images, images that use descriptive alt text. So a comparable experience here is that as a sighted user, you can see the image, you understand what's happening. But if it's meaningful content, how is a screen reader user going to understand the meaning or the way that this adds value to the content? And that's where an alt text would come in. So in that way, you're providing a comparable experience. And on the right of the screen, it's like a screenshot of an authentication error. What we could infer from the images is, or we can't infer that it's announced by a screen reader or not. It's just kind of a screenshot there. And the input from this can be written then in the form of requirements, right? So items that we can specifically design to, not just static observations. We know that I can design the fact that it's a canvas, but I need to design a table and consider how this design is actually going to be fleshed out. If I just provided a design that has this beautiful chart, but I never account for that comparable experience, then it's going to fall short for many of the users. And so in this way, you're establishing real constraints to make sure the design solves a real problem. So the second one is to consider situation. So people use your interface in different situations. So make sure your interface delivers a valuable experience to people regardless of their circumstance. The question I ask myself is, are there relevant situational factors and what are the needs or considerations that address them? So examples, a technician in a noisy environment has to watch instructional videos. So including captions and a transcript means that they don't have to rely on audio. A student working on a sunny patio is helped by increasing contrast, so text is legible. A feature tour is offered to a new app user to help them become quickly familiar with it. All of these are contextual examples and ways that you could think through somebody's different situation as they're coming into the product. On the right of the screen, there are three people. They're huddled around a laptop in what I assume could be a noisy factory environment. And all these examples are really, they're just barely scratching the surface. There's likely dozens of factors to consider just for these alone, but just providing a few high level. And quite honestly, you might not even know how to address some of these factors at this point, and that's okay. So this is where research or exploration during the design process can help further define it. Number three is to be consistent. So use familiar conventions and apply them consistently. I ask myself, will I be consistent within a single view, within across an app or a site, when using a design system, related experiences and heuristics, with the brand aesthetic, voice and tone? So many different ways to be consistent, and asking yourself, where is it important to be uniform? Where is it important to be consistent is a good way to have inclusive input. Jacob's Law from Nielsen Norman Group states that users spend more of their time or most of their time on other sites. And it means that users prefer your site to work the same way as other sites and other patterns that they're already known. So we want to design for things with which they're already accustomed. So that's another way to be consistent. It produces accessibility benefits by both establishing and leveraging patterns that help users to know what is happening and what to expect. So a few examples: navigation in the same location and using the same naming on every page. That's a good way to be consistent. Using design system components in accordance with their documentation. That way the system propagates to different experiences and it's consistent. And lastly, consider what experience or workflow a user has just come from and where they're headed. So there's consistency in the experience itself. On the right side of the screen here is individual entering their credit card information into a website. And a purchase flow is another great example of how the type of experience to consider where someone has been and where they're headed next. Number 4 is give control. So you want to ensure that people are in control. People should always be able to access and interact with content in their preferred way. So again, the question is, how is this content and experience available, malleable and functional, regardless of input, preference, or device type? This is where we start to think about screen readers. We start to think about different modalities, responsive. We want to make sure that the user is in control. So 2 examples: using the keyboard is much faster for some users, and all functionality must be done via keyboard alone. This is a way where we ask ourselves the question and we provide a requirement in the form of this, like everything has to be done with the keyboard, right? So we have that requirement. We know that the design has to satisfy that. And then another example, a documentation site uses small type, but because it uses relative units, a user can increase the size with the browser controls. So we're enabling our design to give the user control. On the right side of the screen, we just see the hands of someone who is typing on a laptop. Anecdotally, I have heard from some developers that do prefer keyboard only, and so this also isn't something that's just relegated to sighted, non-sighted users. It can be broken down into very granularly to any user and the way that they might want to control that content. So number 5, offer choice. Consider providing different ways for people to complete tasks, especially those that are complex or non-standard. So the question, where might it be helpful to provide layout options? Is there unique functionality that should leverage like different input types? So it kind of goes along the same lines as of giving control, but in this case, you're offering choice. So you're making things more optional. A few examples: a list that can be reordered with drag and drop can also be reordered with a keyboard. So there's different choice in how to interact with that. A dashboard with a grid of cards can also be viewed as a more condensed list. An accordion is present, so a user can choose to view longer or more in-depth content. On the right of the screen is a website with the dashboard open. Each section here has options, like an options control, and the main dashboard view can be changed. This is a great example of offering choice, allowing people to consume that content in ways that will make it easier for them or that are more preferred. And you notice that some of these are functional and technical with drag and drop and keyboard, and others are visual or layout with grid versus cards, and others is just showing and hiding content like an accordion. So lots of different ways that you can consider offering choice. All right, 2 more to go. Prioritize content. Help users focus on core tasks, features, and information by prioritizing them within the content and layout. So the question is the hierarchy of the content and the tasks defined? Do the semantics and visual weight support that hierarchy? Priority is really critical for inclusivity and helping users really understand the task at hand and what is expected of them. 2 examples. First, a page has several tasks that can be done, but the primary ones have more visual weight and they're just placed in a more prominent position. This is a great way to just have a simple requirement that can be satisfied in the design. Second, a process in it is in an error state, so maybe a form, and so the error is placed more prominently at the top so it can be addressed first. It's prioritized, it's above the form, so you know that you can move to those different elements that need addressed. These are different ways to prioritize content. And on the right side of the screen is just a sketched wireframe with a few items highlighted in that wireframe. And something as simple as this can help convey priority. All right, 1 more, and then we'll move on. So lastly, add value. And this is where we consider the value of features and how they improve the experience for different users. We ask, what could make the experience easier or more enjoyable? How could device features enhance the experience? So a few examples. A dark UI setting is available for users who find it easier to read or just prefer the aesthetics. This is something where we're adding value. It might not be necessary by default, but it definitely adds value. And I think we have a lot of threads that kind of attest to this one. Second, haptic feedback is provided when an alert appears to provide additional notice. So we're leveraging a device feature to enhance that experience for a user. And lastly, a show password button with a password input helps a user validate input before submitting. This is just another way where we're adding value. We're adding the ability to convey that information and make it usable in a way that benefits the user. And on the right side of the screen, there's a user holding a mobile phone, and it's displaying a login form, and there is an option to show the password. All right, so to this point in the framework, we've considered the 7 principles that functionally kind of create our input, our requirements, and we move those now into design. So how do we actually employ these into the design? And that's the next part of the framework. So the design is intended so that we design artifacts that are created to satisfy input requirements. All right, so here's a photo of a diorama with a wooded scene. This is from the Osaka Museum of Natural History. And there's like a painted mountain scene as a backdrop. It's behind behind replica trees and foliage. And in the foreground, there's a lighted case, and it displays the bugs that would live in this scene, crosscut wood samples to show the different bark. And there are other items too. And this diorama is telling us a story with the artifacts surrounded by everything we need to know to understand it. And accessible output based on a design is kind of like this, hopefully without bugs. But the design it's like the collected experience. It's this scene that we've laid out or the story. And the lighted displays are what help us make sense of it. And our role, we're the curators of this story. And that's really what this is about, is being a good curator of the story and the experience. So inclusive design is a means to an end, but the end doesn't just stop with the design. So I created a kind of a mock dashboard here to kind of close out the application of this. And I called this design effects because we're not creating art. So I didn't want to call it artifacts, but I had to include a pun somewhere because I don't have any animated GIFs. Sorry. I'll leave that to somebody else. So here we have a desktop view of the dashboard, like the dashboard for this mock website. There's navigation, there's search, a theme switcher, notifications, a profile dropdown, several dashboard-like items. And the question I would ask is, how did I arrive at this design? What were the expectations to make it a reality? In other words, like, what was the inclusive input that informed the requirements, and what will be the accessible output? How are all users going to consume this? If I were simply to share this design and expect you to build it, would you know what the expectation is? Would everyone came to the same conclusions about what's intended? I think, that's a rhetorical question. The answer is probably not. And so that leads us to the final piece of the framework, and that is the accessible output. The accessible output communicates intent and accessibility features. So we've looked at different types of input, applied them to our dashboard design, and now we have to communicate that design's intent and the accessibility features so that the design can be brought to life. And just due to time, I know we're getting close here. I'm only going to include a single input from each of the 7 principles that we talked about, just to show how even one small application of inclusive input and thinking can result in better output. So I'm not aiming to be comprehensive here, but just to give you kind of a little bit of a taste of what it's like to work with this framework and show the potential impact. And so while that input took the form of requirements from those principles, the output takes the forms of things like accessibility blue lines, annotation, responsive comps, styles, prototypes. The list goes on and on, but it's whatever kind of artifact or communication you need to make sure that that through line is seen in the design and carried forward. So a few examples here, again, going back to our model of asking questions and having a resulting output. And in this, I'm applying it to that dashboard. So the input, provide a comparable experience. My input for this, the requirement that I came out of that with was that I want to ensure that all users can understand the timeline content from the dashboard. And so I built the design, I have that, I've got the dashboard, I've got the timeline. And so my output to make sure that it's a comparable experience would be to show how the relationships are established in the markup and announced by a screen reader. And what that artifact might look like is something like this, simply just calling out and annotating that a sighted user can determine where they're at, where this bar falls on this timeline between days. And it helps them to understand that both from a visual and a screen reader perspective. So how would something like this make the resulting experience more accessible? Well, in this table, like I mentioned, a sighted user can tell that a specific bar falls across certain days. But now we have content that's added, content behind the content, as I like to call it, that's added so a screen reader user would be able to understand the data in the same way a sighted user would. It fills in the gaps. It allows them to understand this is where this content lives in the relationship. And so accessibility blue lines, they help front end and even copywriting make decisions about how this is communicated to all users. And also it provides something for QA to test this experience against. So this is a really good way to simply provide a comparable experience. Just write out what is the intention? How would somebody else encounter this? The second one is to consider the situation. So for this dashboard, I want to realize that, maybe it's somebody's first time here. So I want to offer a first time user a dashboard tour. So as I'm thinking through this, like what ways might I do that? And in the design comp, I simply just provide an example feature tour overlay. And in this on the left, I'm just highlighting, like in part of the design, part of inclusive is, hey, realizing they might be new. So let's pose a question here. We notice you're new. Would you like a tour? Yes. Remind me later. It's allowing them to access this as they want, but it's empowering them to participate in this experience. And this makes the experience and the outcome more accessible because a new user would be able to quickly familiarize themselves with the dashboard. And also the design provides focus. So we're also bringing in kind of that priority piece and allowing them to walk through it. This is just one simple way, one simple artifact that we can do with our design and how we think about it to make sure that the experience is going to consider that user's situation as they approach it. Next is being consistent. And so in my dashboard, I want to use the design system for color and primary button. And the output of that is that in my design tool in Figma, I'm going to name the color variables the same in the design. So really low hanging fruit here, where we're just making sure that it's consistent. If I were to hand this off and have the inspection mode, a developer could say, oh, okay, I've got the colors. They match what is actually prescribed in the design system. And so this is very useful, and it allows that consistency to happen. And it makes the outcome more accessible because the colors have already been vetted for contrast requirements and naming. And colors that are used here are also used elsewhere for interactive elements. And so they feel familiar or establishing patterns. And so this is a great way to be consistent. Next, if we want to give control, so the next principle, giving control. For my dashboard, I want to use relative units for typography so that they can scale with user settings. And how I might output this from the design. This isn't something that you would just pick up by looking at the design, right? Figma, for example, it's showing things in pixels. It's showing things in very fixed units. So a developer might take that and inspect and say, okay, that's 12 pixels. I'm going to make it 12 pixels. So one way that we communicate our intent is just simply adding commenting or threads, annotating it and saying, hey, like we're using pixels here in the design, but this really should be relative units so that anybody can have control and resize it as necessary. And so this allows the resulting experience to be scaled by the user, and simply including comments, annotations can go a long way to conveying intent. Next up, offer choice. So for this, the dashboard timeline has the option to view by data by week, month, or year. And so I want to demonstrate how content transitions between the views. This is where I have this intent. I'm going to change up this content. If I just hand this off, there's no real communication of how a user is going to interact with this timeline and change it. And so, you build a quick prototype. And how does this make the outcome more accessible? Well, it allows us to think through how change is activated, what activates the change, how that change is communicated for all users. So if we're using tabs, for example, then we can follow the way ARIA authoring guides for building a tab set, which we know would then communicate to a screen reader user that the content has changed. And part of this prototype too is we work up thinking on transitions, and we're allowed to consider alternate behavior for those who prefer reduced motion. Maybe instead of transitioning things or moving them, maybe we want that motion to be reduced. So there's some inclusive thinking that hops in here and allows us to consider this. All right, I know I'm right at time here. So I'm gonna jump through the last two very quickly. So prioritize content. We're just gonna have hierarchy. We're gonna have our annotations mark up what the hierarchy is, what the focus order is for keyboarding. And so by doing this, we allow content to clearly be built semantically and allow that to carry through. And lastly, add value. So let's just incorporate a dark UI theme. What the heck? Let's provide an example of that. So here's the same photo of the diorama from earlier. Only the scene's been replaced now with our design. So in the foreground lighted case, it displays all the artifacts that help us understand the design. And that design is still, it's the main scene. It's the main story that was constructive from the inclusive input. But only now we have the accessible output that help us fully curate that story and convey it. Some of the things in here were really low hanging fruit, while others would definitely take more investment and learning. But it's just a sample of how with little investment, we can make our output more robust. So in summary, when we start with inclusive thinking input, we apply it to crafting accessible and rich output, we better prepare our work to serve more users, which is the end goal. And Hayden, another quote from Hayden Pickering, do a little and do it well for as many people as you can. All right, sorry for going over, but thank you for sticking with me here.
Austin, do you want to verbalize your question?
Sure, I'll do it real quick if we have some time. Jeremy, I tagged you in a thread in an issue actually, but you're talking about making it accessible to users no matter what device, or maybe in this case, a browser a user might use. We might not be able to overcome all of the choices that browsers make. So an example of this would be Firefox by default apparently ignores anchor tags when you're tabbing. So how do we handle those discrepancies in our design system, like in pajamas, if Chrome, for example, will handle those anchor tags and then Firefox won't by default? Technically, we're matching our design system, but you might not be able to access the thing you're trying to get to in the keyboard because there's a deficiency, I guess you could call it.
Yeah.
Where do we show that responsibility?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. So in that instance, that's where that falls back on the browser itself, because there's settings. And if you're not familiar, what Austin's asking about is there's actually settings in Firefox and Safari that you have to turn on so that all elements are focusable by keyboard, like all normal focusable elements. And that's one of the things where you would have to rely on that tool to do that. But the consistency for us happens when we make sure that it is a focusable element. We make sure it is an anchor tag. We make sure that it is a button, etc. So that's where our consistency essentially stops. And then it's up to that browser, that tool that they're accessing it with, to handle, those additional capabilities.
Sweet. That's a helpful answer.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Awesome. The other few points are read only. So thanks so much, Jeremy, for this presentation.
Yep.